porcelain plates weighed exactly 3 pounds each. Add a 12-ounce bone-in ribeye, a smear of truffle butter, and the sheer hostility radiating from the VIP booth, and Nira's forearms were burning. She shifted her grip on the tray. The kitchen doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the chaotic clatter of the back of house. Out here in the private dining room of Laura, the air was thick, heavily air-conditioned, and smelled intensely of seared fat, expensive vetiver, and quiet. Violent tension. Nira smoothed the front of her black apron, making sure the tight coils of her natural hair were pinned securely beneath her uniform collar. She hated the VIP room. The tips were enough to cover rent in a single night, but the patrons always looked right through her, treating her like a piece of moving furniture. Tonight, however, she preferred invisibility. At the center of the mahogany table sat Leo. He didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. There were no flashy rings, no pinstripes. He wore a dark charcoal sweater that hugged the dense muscle of his shoulders. His face was angular, exhausted, and remarkably still. He swirled amber liquid in a crystal glass, his eyes fixed on the men across from him. Opposite Leo sat the delegation. Their point man was Edmund, a sleek, sharp-eyed executive from Seoul, who wore a suit that probably cost more than Nira's car. Between them sat Gregory. Gregory was the translator. Gregory was also sweating through his powder blue dress shirt. Nira stepped up to the table, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the thick carpet. She lowered the first steak in front of Edmund. He didn't acknowledge her. He was speaking rapidly in Korean, his tone sharp, dismissive, and laced with a very specific, polite condescension. Nira knew exactly what he was saying. She had spent 6 years working double shifts at a 24-hour barbecue joint in Koreatown before upgrading to this high-end steakhouse. She knew the language better than she knew her own extended family. She knew the slang, the honorifics, and the insults disguised as business propositions. "We are offering a 20% cut of the shipping routes," Edmund said in Korean, his eyes narrowing at Leo. "And frankly, given your recent operational failures at the docks, that is a charity. Take it, or we find someone who knows how to control their own territory." Nira inhaled slowly, the scent of rosemary and garlic hitting her nose as she moved to place Leo's plate. She waited for Gregory to translate the insult. Gregory cleared his throat, dabbing his forehead with a linen napkin. "Mr. Edmund says." Gregory's voice was reedy, trembling slightly. "He says they are pleased to offer 30% of the shipping routes. He understands there have been minor delays, but he is confident in a long and prosperous partnership." Nira froze. The water pitcher in her left hand tilted a fraction of an inch too far. A single drop of ice water hit the mahogany table. Gregory wasn't just softening the blow. He was lying. Outright, dangerously lying. She looked at Gregory. The man's pulse was visibly throbbing in his neck. He was terrified. Why? Was he working for someone else? Trying to skim the 10% difference? Or was he just a coward trying to keep two violent syndicates from shooting each other in a steakhouse? Leo leaned forward. The leather of his chair creaked. It was the only sound in the room for 3 long seconds. 30%, Leo murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Nira's chest. Generous. Tell Edmund I appreciate his flexibility. Gregory nodded frantically, turning back to Edmund. He spoke in broken, heavily accented Korean. He says 30% is good. He accepts. Edmund's face tightened. He fired back, slamming a hand flat on the table. I said 20. You idiot. Do not play games with me. Tell him 20, and tell him he has until midnight to sign the port authority papers, or we burn his warehouses down. Nira stood perfectly still, clutching the empty serving tray against her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Walk away, Nira. Walk away right now. She had a mountain of student debt, an eviction notice staring her down if she didn't make rent by Friday, and a strict personal policy of minding her own black business. Getting involved in a mafia dispute was not on her bingo card for a Tuesday night. What did he say? Leo asked, his eyes cutting to Gregory. Gregory swallowed hard. He says he is glad you accept. The paperwork will be ready by tomorrow morning. Nira closed her eyes. The sheer audacity of the lie made her stomach churn. If Leo signed whatever they put in front of him, thinking he was getting 30%, and the contract said 20, there would be blood in the streets. And Gregory? Gregory would be on a flight to the Caymans by dawn, leaving Leo holding the bag. She opened her eyes. Leo was raising his glass, a rare, faint smirk touching the corner of his mouth. He was buying it. The cold, untouchable boss of the city's underground was being played by a sweaty middleman in a cheap suit. Nira took a step back, intending to slip through the heavy oak doors and disappear into the kitchen, but her gaze snagged on the bodyguard standing behind Leo. The man's jacket was unbuttoned, revealing the dark, matte grip of a pistol tucked into his waistband. If this went south tomorrow, people would die. Maybe innocent people at the docks. Maybe people in her neighborhood. "Excuse me," Nira said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the hushed, acoustic perfection of the VIP room, it sounded like a gunshot. Everyone at the table stopped. Gregory whipped around, his eyes wide. Edmund looked up, annoyed. Leo slowly lowered his glass, his expression shifting from calm to something incredibly dark and unreadable. He looked at Nira as if seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. "What?" Leo asked softly. Nira's palms were slick with sweat against the plastic tray. She could feel the heat creeping up her neck. "God, I am an idiot. More water, sir?" She managed to choke out, her cynical edge completely failing her. Leo stared at her. His eyes were the color of bruised iron. He looked at her apron, her name tag, and then up to her face. He didn't say a word. He just stared, dissecting her hesitation, reading the panic she was trying so hard to mask. "No," Leo said, never breaking eye contact. "You didn't stop a multi-million-dollar negotiation to ask about water." Nira pressed her lips together. The air in the room felt 20 degrees colder. Edmund was muttering something irritated in Korean to his own muscle. "I apologize for the interruption, sir," Nira said smoothly, slipping back into her professional customer service voice. "I will leave you to your meal." She turned, taking one step toward the door. "Stop." The command wasn't yelled. It was barely spoken above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an absolute absolute. Nira's sneakers planted firmly into the carpet. She didn't want to turn around. She wanted to run. "Look at me," Leo said. Nira slowly turned. Leo gestured with 2 fingers, a tiny flick of his wrist. His bodyguard immediately stepped forward, blocking the exit. The click of the door locking echoed like a gavel striking wood. "You heard something," Leo said, leaning back, lacing his fingers over his stomach. "Something that made you stop. What was it?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Nira lied, keeping her face perfectly blank. It was a skill she had perfected over years of dealing with aggressive customers and terrible managers. "I just thought your glass was low." Gregory let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Boss, she's just a waitress. Probably overwhelmed. Let's just get back to the—" "Shut up, Gregory," Leo said. He didn't even look at the translator. His focus was entirely on Nira. "You looked at Gregory. Then you looked at Edmund. Then you looked at me like I was a dead man walking. Why?" Nira swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She looked at Gregory. The translator was giving her a desperate, pleading look, subtly shaking his head. "Don't do it." Nira thought about her rent. She thought about the tip she was definitely going to lose. Then she thought about the sheer disrespect of Gregory trying to play this man in her dining room. "Your translator is lying," Nira said. The words tasted like copper in her mouth. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that usually precedes a car crash. Gregory leaped up from his chair scraping violently against the floor. "She's crazy! Boss, she doesn't know what she's talking about! She's a waitress!" Leo didn't move. He didn't flinch at Gregory's outburst. "Is that so?" he asked Nira, his voice dropping an octave. "He's altering the terms," Nira said, her voice steadying as the adrenaline finally overrode her fear. If she was going to get fired or worse, she wasn't going to stutter. Edmund didn't offer 30%. He offered 20. And he called it a charity, because your operations at the docks are a mess. Edmund, who had been watching the exchange with narrowing eyes, suddenly sat up straight. He didn't speak perfect English, but he clearly understood the numbers. What else? Leo asked, his eyes never leaving Nira's. He didn't say the paperwork would be ready tomorrow, Nira continued, pointing a short manicured nail at Edmund. He said, "You have until midnight to sign the Port Authority papers, or they are going to burn your warehouses to the ground." Gregory lunged. He didn't go for Nira, he went for the door. But before he could even clear the corner of the table, Leo's bodyguard moved. A massive hand shot out, grabbing Gregory by the collar and slamming him face first into the mahogany. The crystal water glasses rattled. Gregory shrieked, a pathetic, muffled sound against the wood. Leo slowly stood up. He was taller than Nira realized. He walked around the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped right in front of Nira. She had to tilt her head back slightly to look him in the eye. Up close, he smelled like expensive bourbon and danger. "Where did you learn Korean?" he asked quietly. "K-Town. 5 years working the graveyard shift at a barbecue spot," Nira said, her chin lifting defiantly. "You pick things up when people are drunk and think you aren't listening." Leo studied her face. He was looking for a lie, for a tremor, for any sign that she was part of a setup. Nira stared back, refusing to shrink. She was exhausted, her feet ached, and she was done being intimidated by men in expensive clothes. Leo turned his head slightly toward Edmund. "Edmund," Leo said in English. 20%? Edmund looked at Gregory, who was currently bleeding from his nose onto the table, and then back to Leo. He nodded once, stiffly. "Yes. 20. And the midnight deadline." Leo let out a slow, sharp exhale. He reached down, grabbed Gregory by the hair, and pulled the translator's head up. Gregory was sobbing. "Who paid you?" Leo asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Was it the Russians? Trying to start a war between me and Edmund?" "I just needed the money, Mr. Leo. I swear," Gregory cried, blood dripping onto his teeth. "They promised me 100 grand, just to change the numbers. They said you'd sign it and sort it out later." Leo let go of his hair, letting Gregory's face smack back against the table. He looked at his bodyguard. "Get him out of here. Find out exactly who paid him, then throw him in the river." The bodyguard hauled the weeping translator out the back exit, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. The room was suddenly very empty. Just Nira, Leo, Edmund, and Edmund's silent muscle. Leo turned back to Nira. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and held them out to her. "For your trouble," Leo said, "and your discretion. You can leave now." Nira looked at the money. $500. It was half her rent. It was an out. She could walk through those doors, go back to rolling silverware, and pretend none of this ever happened. She reached out and took the bills, slipping them into her apron pocket. "Thank you." She turned to walk away. "Wait," Edmund suddenly spoke up, his accented English thick and heavy. He pointed at Nira. "We are not finished. We have no translator." Leo looked at Edmund, then slowly turned his gaze back to Nira. The faint smirk was back on his face. "He makes a good point." Nira stopped at the door. "Absolutely not. I am a waitress. I have tables in Section 4. Section 4 is closed," Leo said smoothly. He pulled out the chair Gregory had just vacated. It had a small smear of blood on the armrest. "Sit down." "I am not sitting in the blood chair," Nira said flatly. Leo paused, genuinely surprised by the pushback. A quiet, raspy chuckle escaped his chest. He kicked Gregory's chair away and pulled out a pristine leather chair from the adjacent table, sliding it into the open spot. "Better?" he asked. Nira looked at the chair, then at Leo, then at the heavy oak doors separating her from her normal, boring life. She sighed, a deep, bone-weary sound, and walked back to the table. She smoothed her apron and sat down, folding her hands neatly over the mahogany. "Fine," Nira said, looking directly at Edmund. She switched to flawless, rapid-fire Korean. "He says 30% is a joke, but he appreciates your attempt at humor. Now, let's talk real numbers before he decides to burn down your boats instead." Edmund's eyes went wide. Leo watched Nira, a dangerous mix of amusement and genuine intrigue flashing in his dark eyes. "What did you just tell him?" Nira didn't look at Leo. She kept her eyes locked on Edmund. I told him, "You're open to counteroffers." Cold fat began to congeal on the edges of the Wagyu ribeye sitting between them. The rich, earthy scent of truffle butter had soured in the tight air of the VIP room, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of Gregory's blood drying on the mahogany wood. Nira's right knee bounced under the table, a violent, uncontrollable tremor of pure adrenaline. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh, forcing the leg still. Edmund's face was a mask of cold fury. He stared at Nira as if she were a sudden, unexplainable mathematical error. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and spoke rapidly. "You are overstepping, girl," Edmund spat in Korean, dropping all formal honorifics. He was using the linguistic equivalent of speaking to a stray dog. "You serve food. You do not negotiate for animals who cannot even secure their own cargo. Tell him 20%, or the Port Authority gets a phone call in 10 minutes. Nira didn't flinch. She had been called worse by hungover college kids, angry about cold kimchi fried rice at 3 in the morning. She turned her head slowly to Leo. Leo was watching her. He didn't speak Korean, but he was fluent in body language. He saw the slight tightening of Edmund's jaw, the dismissive wave of his hand, and the way Nira's spine went rigid. "Well?" Leo asked, his voice a low rumble over the hum of the overhead air conditioning. "What's his counter?" "He dropped the honorifics," Nira said, keeping her tone flat, refusing to let the insult bleed into her voice. "He just called you an animal who can't secure his own cargo. He says 20%, or he calls the Port Authority in 10 minutes and shuts you down." Leo didn't blink. He reached for his glass, the ice clinking loudly in the dead quiet of the room. He took a slow sip. "Tell him," Leo said softly, placing the glass back on the table, "that if he makes that phone call, he will never see Seoul again. Tell him 25%. And he gives me 48 hours to clear the backlog at the docks. Non-negotiable." Nira inhaled. The air felt thin, useless in her lungs. She turned back to Edmund. She didn't just translate the words. She translated the terrifying, absolute certainty in Leo's voice. She matched Edmund's disrespect, using a specifically sharp, clipped dialect from the southern provinces of Korea, a dialect known for its bluntness. One she learned from a chain-smoking line cook named Mrs. Choi. "He says 25, Nira said in Korean, her voice dropping an octave. "And 48 hours to clear the docks. If you reach for your phone to call the Port Authority, you will die in this city." He is not asking. Edmund's eyes narrowed. He looked past Nira, studying Leo. Leo stared back, completely relaxed, his broad shoulders resting against the leather chair. The silence stretched. The antique clock on the wall ticked a heavy, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that seemed to sync with the pounding pulse behind Nira's ears. Edmund broke first. He let out a short, cynical breath through his nose. He reached inside his tailored jacket. Nira's breath hitched, her muscles bracing for the deafening crack of a gunshot. But Edmund only produced a silver fountain pen. He uncapped it with a soft click. 25, Edmund said in Korean, his tone begrudgingly respectful again. 48 hours. But if one single crate of electronics is missing from Pier 4, we renegotiate this with a match and gasoline. Nira translated the terms to Leo. Leo gave a single, microscopic nod. "Print the new contracts," he told Edmund's muscle, who had been standing silently by the wall. The next 20 minutes were a blur of agonizing bureaucracy. Edmund's man produced a portable printer from a leather briefcase, the mechanical whirring sound utterly bizarre in the middle of a mob summit. Nira sat trapped between them, proofreading the new Korean contract against the English one. Her eyes burned. The cheap orthotic inserts in her shoes felt like concrete blocks. Her stomach gave a sudden, loud rumble, violently protesting the fact that she hadn't eaten since a handful of stale fries at 4 p.m. Edmund's gaze flicked to her stomach. Leo's lips twitched. Nira felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. "Please, just sign the papers, so I can go cry in the walk-in freezer." "Line 12, Nira said suddenly, tapping a manicured nail against the thick paper. She looked at Leo. The English version says, "All damages incurred during transit are the responsibility of the shipping party." The Korean version has a subtle character shift. It says all damages and pre-existing deficits. Leo's head tilted. Meaning? Meaning, Nira said, feeling the weight of Edmund's murderous glare burning into the side of her face. If they lost a shipment of microchips 3 weeks ago in Tokyo, they can legally blame you for it tomorrow. It's a liability trap. Leo looked at Edmund. A cold, terrifying smile spread across Leo's face. It didn't reach his eyes. Fix line 12, Edmund, or we go back to my previous threat. Edmund didn't argue. He muttered a filthy curse under his breath, snatched the paper, and barked at his man to reprint the page. 10 minutes later, the signatures were dry. Edmund stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't offer his hand to Leo. Instead, he looked down at Nira. You are wasting your talent carrying plates, Edmund said in Korean. He gave her a short, stiff bow, a sign of genuine respect, and walked out the heavy oak doors, his bodyguard trailing like a shadow. The heavy latch clicked shut. Nira sat frozen for a full 10 seconds. Then, the adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands began to shake so violently she had to clench them together in her lap. The room spun slightly. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of stale steak and old blood, trying to ground herself. She heard the scrape of a chair, the clink of glass. When she opened her eyes, a crystal tumbler, filled with amber liquid, was sitting exactly 2 inches from her hand. Leo was sitting across from her, his elbows resting on the table. The hostility that had radiated from him all night was gone, replaced by a quiet, heavy curiosity. Drink it, Leo said. I don't drink on shift, Nira rasped. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Your shift ended the second you called my translator a liar, Leo pointed out. Drink. It helps with the shakes. Nira looked at her trembling hands. She hated that he could see it. She hated being vulnerable in front of a man who casually ordered people thrown into rivers. But the smell of the bourbon, rich, smoky, and complex, was intoxicating. She picked up the glass. It clinked sharply against her teeth before she took a swallow. The burn was immediate. It tracked a line of fire down her throat and settled hot in her empty stomach. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Better? Leo asked. Nira coughed gently into her fist, setting the glass down, significantly. Leo leaned back. What's your name? Nira. Nira, he repeated. He tasted the syllables, rolling them over his tongue. You saved me roughly $4 million tonight, Nira, and potentially a dock war. You gave me $500. I consider us even. She started to stand up, her knees wobbling slightly. If you'll excuse me, I have to go explain to my manager why I've been locked in the VIP room for an hour. Sit down, Leo said. It wasn't a request. The temperature in the room dropped again. Nira's instincts flared. That bone-deep survival mechanism she had honed growing up in a neighborhood where running from the wrong person got you killed, but staying also got you killed. She slowly lowered herself back into the chair. I need a new translator, Leo said flatly. Someone who catches liability traps on line 12. Someone who doesn't flinch when Edmund drops his honorifics. Nira stared at him. Are you insane? No, absolutely not. Leo's brow furrowed slightly. It was clear he wasn't used to hearing the word no. You make, what, 40,000 a year here? 50 on a good year with tips? That is none of your business. I'll pay you 200,000, base salary. Cash or heavily laundered W-2S? Your choice, Leo continued, ignoring her entirely. You attend meetings. You read contracts. You tell me when someone across the table is trying to slit my throat. Nira let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. And when someone actually decides to slit your throat, or mine, do I get hazard pay? You'll be protected. Like Gregory? Nira shot back, gesturing to the bloodstain on the table. Leo didn't flinch. Gregory betrayed me. You won't. You don't know me, Nira said. She leaned forward, the fear receding, replaced by a deep, exhaustion-fueled irritation. Listen to me, Mr. Leo. I have $60,000 in student loans for a communications degree that is currently entirely useless. I have a landlord who texts me threats, in all caps. My car transmission is held together by duct tape and prayers. I am stressed enough. I am not adding Mafia target to my daily list of anxieties. Leo watched her face. He noted the dark circles under her eyes. the worn edges of her apron, the way she guarded herself with sarcasm. You're surviving, Nira, Leo said quietly. The gravel in his voice smoothed out, becoming dangerously soft. You aren't living. You're waiting for the next disaster to wipe you out. A broken transmission. An eviction. One bad month and you fall off the edge? Nira swallowed hard. He was hitting too close to the bone. It felt invasive. It felt raw. Working for me, Leo continued, leaning in until she could smell the vetiver cologne on his skin, gives you control. It gives you an edge. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys taking orders from shift managers with half your intellect. I prefer my criminals to wear name tags and complain about cold soup, Nira said stubbornly, though her voice lacked its earlier bite. Leo reached into his jacket. Nira tensed again, but he just pulled out a sleek black business card. He slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped right next to her empty whiskey glass. There was no name on it, just a phone number. You have until Friday, Leo said, standing up. He buttoned his charcoal sweater, suddenly looking massive, imposing, and completely in control of the room again. If I don't hear from you by noon, I'll find someone else. He turned and walked toward the door. And Nira? Leo paused, his hand on the heavy brass handle. He looked over his shoulder. The dim lighting caught the sharp angles of his face. Nira didn't answer. She just looked at him. Keep the 500, he said. Buy a decent meal. You look like you're going to pass out. He opened the door and walked out, his silent bodyguard melting out of the shadows to follow him. Nira sat alone in the dead quiet of the VIP room. The air felt heavy. She looked at the blood stain on the wood. She looked at the cold, ruined steaks. Then, she looked at the matte black business card resting on the table. Slowly, carefully, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the thick cardstock. It felt heavy. It felt like a loaded gun. She slipped it into her apron pocket, right next to the wad of cash, and stood up to clear the plates. Nira's choice between the crushing safety of poverty and the deadly wealth of the underworld is just beginning. Will she dial that number? Find out in part 3. If her raw survival instinct hooked you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who craves gritty, grounded mafia romance, and subscribe so you don't miss the next dangerous chapter of Nira and Leo's dark new partnership.